warm and the room hotter. Then she pushed her jaw shut, and Hailu heard the crisp snap of the capsule and the girl's muffled groan. The smell of almonds, sticky and sweet, rose from her mouth. She gasped for air, but Hailu knew she was already suffocating from the poison. She was choking. She took his hand and moved it to her heart and pressed it down. He wanted to think that last look before she closed her eyes was gratitude. It was only his nurse Almaz who'd recognized the vivid flush of the girl's face, the faint hint of bitter almonds, and known what had happened. She'd walked in just as Hailu was explaining to the soldiers how the electric shocks she'd received had damaged her internally. "Oh," Almaz said. "Yes," she collected herself. It was too much for her, too much infection. The soldiers were agitated. They paced back and forth. They asked Hailu again and again to explain exactly what had happened. "The infection was climbing from her feet to her heart," he repeated. "There was no way to stop it. She was too weak to fight it. But she was waking up," they said. "She was getting better," they said. "We told the colonel she would be back," they said. Hailu's palms were sweaty. He heard a ringing in his ears that seemed to get louder as he talked. He cleared his throat. "It was a surprise for all of us," he said. The girl's body was still in the bed, covered completely in a sheet. They hadn't filled out the necessary forms. The soldiers had yet to acknowledge these next steps. "You have to do something," one soldier demanded. He grabbed Hailu's arm and shook it. "We reported she'd be able to leave in a few days. People are expecting her." He tightened his grip. "Do something." "I'll write up the death certificate," Hailu said. "Everything will be explained there." "I'm a witness," Almaz said. There was nothing we could do. And yet now, Hailu sat at his desk in the dark. He'd been summoned to the jail officially. His presence was requested in writing, delivered to him by 3 skinny soldiers who spoke in unison. They'd walked into the hospital and gone to his office. They stood in a straight line, their shoulders even, their identical uniforms, the way they each planted their feet the exact same width apart and had their hands folded in front of them, made Hailu think he was looking at triplets, though they were nothing alike in appearance. Watching them address him had been as confusing to Hailu as the order itself, handed down by a man most only knew as the colonel. "You were told to come in. We spoke to your friend," they said. Here is a written order. Come to the jail tomorrow. Arrive by dawn," they said. "The colonel wakes up early." "What's this about?" Hailu looked at the ink signature at the bottom of the letter and tried to imagine the man whose hand moved across the page with such jagged sweeps of the pen. "I have to work tomorrow. I'm scheduled for surgery." 2 of them turned to look at the 3rd soldier. He stepped forward. "Please don't disobey," he said. "Should I bring a suitcase?" Hailu asked. Most prisoners were ordered to bring a suitcase of clothes under the pretext that they'd return home eventually. Soldiers took the suitcases and added to their wardrobe, many of them wearing to bars and parties the clothes of those they'd executed. "You won't need to," the 3rd soldier said. Hailu tried not to think about the fact that no one he knew ever returned from a summons to jail. "Tomorrow," they said before walking out of the office. "Don't disobey this time." Hailu sat in his chair with the lights off. He sat with his back straight as a tree, and he waited. Though for what, he wasn't sure. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lon. Our next reader will be Gregory Barlow. Gregory's first book, Totem, has been described as visionary, elegant, deeply autobiographical, offering gorgeous images that capture snapshots of the blue-collar world in language that is both urban and highbrow. The book is the winner of the American Poetry Review / Mornington First Book Prize. Gregory's poetry can also be found in the pages of Callaloo, American Poetry Review, Plowshares, Tin House, among other publications. Gregory is the recipient of a number of fellowships, as are listed in your programs, and is a Gave Conum Fellow, as well as an associate editor of Callaloo. His second book of Poetry Digest is forthcoming. Please join me in welcoming Gregory Bartlett.
Thanks, Tom. That was fantastic. I am, of course, honored to read for you all. I give readings all the time, and I'm never nervous. But as soon as I get in front of students, I freak out. So just be patient with me. Double Dutch. The girls turning double Dutch bob and weave like boxers pulling punches, shadowing each other, sparring across the slack cord, casting parabolas in the air. They whip quick as an infant's pulse, and the jumper, before she enters the winking, nods in time as if she has a notion to share, waiting her chance to speak. But she's anticipating the upbeat, like a band leader counting off the tune they are about to swing into. The jumper stair-steps into mid-air as if she's jumping rope in low gravity, training for a lunar mission. Airborne a moment long enough to fit a second thought in, she looks caught in the mouth bones of a fish as she flutter floats into motion, like a figure in a stack of time-lapse photos thumbed alive. Once inside, the bells tied to her shoestrings rouse the gods who've lain in the dust since the Dutch acquired Manhattan. How she dances patterns like a dust-heavy bee, retracing its travels in scale before the hive. How the whole stunning contraption of girl and rope slaps and scoots like a paddle boat. Her misted skin arranges the light with each adjustment and flex, now heather-hued, now sheen, light listing on the fulcrum of a wrist and the bare jutted joints of elbow and knee, and the faceted surfaces of muscle, surfaces fracturing and reforming like a sun-tickled sleeve of running water. She makes jewelry of herself and garlands the ground with shadows. So I've always been envious of painters. I wish I had some kind of visual dexterous talent, but that was not the case. It was not for me. So one of the ways I cope with this is by finding situations in which I can bring together poets and painters. So Georgia O'Keeffe had a vacation home on Lake George in upstate New York. She was married to the photographer Alfred Stieglitz. And you may know the writer Gene Toomer, the Harlem Renaissance writer Gene Toomer. Well, he was doing a work of translation of this mystic philosopher, and he was friends with Stieglitz, and Stieglitz invited him up to Lake George to do these translations, while O'Keeffe coincidentally was there recovering from one of her breakdowns. And meet they did. This is called Restoring O'Keeffe. Something of a cure lay in that rustic lodge, clear exhaust off Lake George, winter ticking intaglios across the pane, and Gene Toomer tapping on his underwood in the guest room upstairs. All week she shared with him her soups and the baskets arrived from New York. Remarked the nub of the citrus fruit against his hesitating palm, his tawny, graceless hand. Whether he leaked Gurdjieff's freedom of love into the frond of her ear, or Georgia had the servant tincture a remedy with the herb used to seduce, she pulled together one night with a calvados and a snifter like a handful of flame, and Santa Fe whistling through the mind like a desert train. Tawny earth and ineluctable sky, she thought, though the window held the pallor of snow and moon crusted to the clearing beyond a grid of gaslight, cold hushing the cantor of Harlem, eliding his orbit with hers. You have a feminine soul, she said, cooling his face in her hands, measuring his eyes against a gray scale of sexuality. She held his head to her skirted hip. Cleft of peach, he said with his hands at the small of her back. So I'm going to read some from the forthcoming book digest. One of the things we know about slave narratives is that they're conventionally, they all start out with the same three words: I was born. And they also are attended by this list of authority figures who attest to the veracity of the authorship. So they'll say the titles of slave narratives will be written by himself to demonstrate that this was indeed the slave, the former slave, who was the author, and you'll have these people sort of verifying that. So I collaged a bunch of images from various slave narratives. This is called Written by Himself. I was born in minutes in a roadside kitchen, a skillet whispering my name. I was born to rainwater and lie. I was born across the river where I was borrowed with clothespins, a harrow tooth, broadside sewn in my shoes. I returned, though it please you, through no fault of my own, pockets filled with coffee grounds,